Well, hello and welcome everyone. Today we have a great honor to have Uroš Matić with us. And also a very interesting topic that I'm really enthusiastic about to hear more and to learn more. So Uroš is a kind of superstar in this field. He's currently working at the College of Social Science and Humanities and University of Alliance of Ruhr. I hope I pronounced it correctly and I didn't offend the whole German nation with my pronunciation. And so, as I said, it's going to be a really interesting topic and I could say like relatively new, no? That if you agree. And so maybe we can start with how did you come to this why gender archaeology and what actually lead you to this?
Thank you, Natasha, for inviting me, and thanks for everyone tonight for joining us, or morning, or wherever you are. And yeah, it's a question I get a lot. How did I get into gender archaeology? I think it started in my first BA year when I heard several lectures about prehistory at the University of Belgrade, and noticed that some of the interpretations of prehistoric figurines are a little bit dubious and that there is more to that. So I asked around, and as a first year BA student, got a reader in gender archaeology by Stasha Babic, who was a professor of classical archaeology and also theoretical archaeology in Belgrade. And I started reading it, and I found a great interest for gender archaeology. But like my other general interest in gender studies in modern societies, but also past societies, comes also from my own kind of gender troubles and struggles. I don't know. When I was a teenager, I somehow felt that I'm not masculine enough compared to other guys in my high school. So there was always this kind of gender comparison, who is doing manhood or masculinity right or wrong, and in what way, and what is expected of me, what can I wear, what I'm not supposed to wear, how to wear my hair, how to, which kind of a bag to have, and so on. So all of these things then later on, combining with archaeology, told me that when gender is concerned, gender, not sex, there's nothing natural about it. We can be very creative about everything we do with gender. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will definitely talk more, I guess, about this difference, gender and sex, which is really the essential in this case. But yeah, it's interesting that there was always some personal reasons why we decide or not to do something, and it's always better when we also have our own similar like reasons or something. But how often do you hear, especially from maybe older colleagues, like that this is not real archaeology and that it's something maybe invented?
Well, it depends in which environment. This is an excellent question, because we just recently published a volume called Gender Trouble in Current Archaeological Debates with Biserka Gajdarska, Marta Diaz Guardamino, and Laura Kotzofean. And one of the reasons we decided to work on this volume was exactly this question, that on one side, what we call Western academia, or global North, academia considers gender to be kind of an established research topic on university level and also in research institutions, and that everything is doing well since the 90s. We have developed as a field and so on. But then when you look at certain other communities, like, let's say, for example, Southeastern Europe, Balkan archaeology, it was hard for me when I now submitted an abstract for the EAA session in Belgrade to gather people to speak about gender in Balkan archaeology from prehistory until early modern period. there was no one basically. So the people who submitted their papers were, so to say, already known suspects, people who already did research on gender archaeology. And it turned out that there are regions in the world where exactly this topic is not considered to be archaeological enough, or not archaeology at all, or maybe simply they do not have interest in such topics. So there are a variety of reasons. But yes, sometimes these comments come. And it's funny though, because in archaeology, because we deal with humans, and let's say even if we take for granted that we are dealing with men and women and no other gender, by this very fact, we are dealing with gender always. Whenever we make statements about who is cooking, who is taking care of children, who is going to war, who is violent, who is not violent, who eats what, who suffers from which diseases, and so on, we are making statements about gender. Therefore, there is no way out of gender in archaeology. You're either aware of this or not. And the more you are aware of it, the more scientific or objective you can get, because you know what are the unconscious biases you might have.
Yeah, but I think it's really like in a way, let's say dangerous, like because we always had this explanation of gender roles that we have today. That is something very natural. That's been there forever. And we were using a lot of archaeology in this term to justify the previous order. So it's something that is really like, I think it's shaking the base of these beliefs from the past. So that's why I can easily understand why some people can feel very threatened by that. But that's why it's so interesting, because question is here, science is here to ask questions, not to just, making establishments and it's like saying like, yeah, that's it, and no more questions about that. So yeah, I will let you talk now, and I really can't wait to hear more. And I'm sure that so the others that join this webinar, I just wanted to make the short explanation that, okay, like if you want to ask, right now you're all unmuted. Sorry, you're all muted. So when we finish with this presentation, with webinar, you can of course ask questions, and make sure that you or unmute yourself or ask question in the chat. But please, during the presentation of Uroš, don't ask any questions, because it can be really like not disturbing, but yeah, a little bit like breaking the concentration. So all mic is yours, and let's hear.
Thank you very much. So welcome everyone. Natasha invited me to this webinar to give like a very broad lecture about what is gender archaeology and which challenges and perspectives do we have in current bioarchaeology. So I'm going to talk tonight about both bioarchaeology and archaeology in general. I have to stress that I'm not a bioarchaeologist. I do not have a background in physical anthropology. However, as you will see in this lecture, I consider bioarchaeology and physical anthropology to be essential for gender archaeology or gender studies of past societies in general. So we cannot work without each other. Archaeologists specialized in material culture, historians specialized in texts, art historians specialized in visual representations from the past, and bioarchaeologists, we all have to work together in this field we call gender studies in the past. So first, I would like to give you an overview of the topics I'm going to cover. And of course, I want to stress, these are not all the topics one can deal with in gender archaeology. So at the beginning, I'm going to give a very broad introduction about gender studies in general and troubles with gender studies different departments and communities are having today. Then I'm going to talk about the possibility of finding or having more than one gender in a society. This leads me to the issue of coloniality of gender. I know that this term maybe sounds a little bit strange or is a mouthful, coloniality of gender, but I will try to explain what that means and why is that important for us archaeologists. Then I'm going to turn to the issue of so-called gender performativity. Why? I think it is very important to stress this one view of gender, because I think it is very often misinterpreted outside of gender, queer, and feminist studies, and especially in archaeology. And I think that the reason for this is that most archaeologists did not read these foundational theoretical works in their original form, so they tend to simplify very complex arguments and therefore make wrong assessments, conclusions, or insights. And then I'm, of course, moving to bioarchaeology of gender. And the last topic before conclusion is fingerprinting gender. We will see what that is. Of course, I have to do an homage to gender archaeologists since the 70s until today, but I do not have time to mention every single name or to mention every single study. The studies you can see here are just an overview. I have to stress that the so-called women and gender studies in archaeology started already in the 70s in Scandinavian countries in Europe, but then quickly also in the 80s in the UK and US. The field has grown since then to include different other communities in South America, in Spain, Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, and so on and so forth. Of course, also Asian archaeology, Australian archaeology, African archaeology. So as I said, it is impossible to give respect to all of the scholars who have contributed to this field. And for those of you who are interested, I have written a reference to one of the foundational texts in gender archaeology by Conky and Spector from Advances in Archaeological Method and Theory, and some older and newer monographs and edited volumes where you can find a very broad overview of all the topics tackled by gender archaeologists. For example, monographs by Mary Louise Sorensen and Roberta Gilchrist on gender archaeology, and then different companions to gender in prehistory, for example, or a handbook for gender archaeology, or some volumes which are handling more current debates, such as the so-called third science revolution, issues of migration in the past, ancient DNA, strontium analysis, and so on and so forth. And now I would like to very quickly stress why gender at all. For those of you who never heard about gender, you don't even know what is the term, for example, I would strongly advise reading the book Who's Afraid of Gender by Judith Butler, which was published last year. And don't be afraid, this is not a book about gender theory. So in this book, Judith Butler is not dealing with the question how to define gender, how to approach gender or sex. She deals with the issue of how the term gender, or what we associate with it, has been politicized. And therefore, it's also important for us archaeologists to be aware of these issues. And Judith Butler stresses in this book that gender has become a contested and politicized issue globally. So as we could see, for example, recently in the United States of America, there have been a movement towards closing entire gender studies department and so on, cleaning gender as a topic from all university fields. Something similar before has happened in Hungary. There was also an issue in the country I originally come from, Serbia, where the Serbian Orthodox Church actually wanted to reform biology books for children in schools, because in these school books, the authors who are scientists and biologists working at the University of Belgrade Faculty for Biology, they differentiated between sex and gender. So the moment this was put in a school book for children of elementary school level, Serbian Orthodox Church reacted as if any of the church members has any knowledge of biology, social studies, humanities, history of gender, archaeology, anthropology, and so on, in order to make such decisions. So the point is here, as Judith Butler makes, that nowadays everyone wants to talk about gender. Everyone wants to talk about intersex or trans or other human rights, and everyone feels kind of entitled to make decisions about how different people should live their lives, how they should dress, how they should call themselves, and so on and so forth. And very often this is tied to broader right-wing movements, authoritarian politics, and traditional social hierarchies, where there is only one way of being a man or a woman. And as we all know, this is not true, because even in past societies, we have different forms of masculinities and femininities. One of the examples I always give is wearing makeup. In our modern culture, it is usually associated to women and femininity, unless you find yourself in some kind of a subculture, let's say goth metal fans, men or women of different sexualities and views of their bodies, like to wear makeup and so on, or other metalheads and so on. But in ancient Egypt, for example, makeup was not gendered. So men and women wearing eyeliners and eyeshadows did not associate wearing makeup to any gender specifically. They simply associated it to being beautiful and healthy, and that's it. So this is a good example on how certain expectations we might have of men and women nowadays are not necessarily rooted in nature, and we should not judge on others due to their very cultural choices. Now, where does this term gender come from? I would now like to ask you to think about whether or not you have a term gender in your own languages. So when you think about your own body, think about, do you call the difference between a man and a woman a biological sex? Or do you use several words for these differences? For example, in English language, we differentiate between sex and gender. In my own Serbian language, we also differentiate between pol, which would be biological sex, and rod, which would be gender. But in Serbian, rod also means kin. So you can see that different cultures have different ways of organizing bodies and identities. And this is very important, because when we speak about gender studies or gender archaeology, we are clearly taking concepts from one culture and kind of taking it for granted that we can use it in all societies and all cultures everywhere. And this is a problem, because the word gender, although used before mid of 20th century, as a concept, as a theoretical concept, was developed in so-called sexology, psychology, and medical sciences in the mid 20th century. And how did this word gender or concept emerged? Originally, it was used as a tool for regulating bodies and behaviors of those individuals we nowadays call intersex and trans. So here it is important to make some differences in terminology. When we say cis person, cis man or woman, we are referring to someone who is born male or female, a man or a woman, and identifies as a man or a woman. But we also have individuals who are born as men or women, but identified as the opposite sex or gender. And therefore, we call these individuals trans. Of course, this terminology, which emerged at the period I just mentioned, is contested every single day, even by members of the trans community, because when you label someone as cis or trans or heterosexual, homosexual, and so on, bisexual, this is a very medicalized term, as if this is a kind of a condition you have, and then you need treatment. And why am I stressing this? Because at the mid of the 20th century, the word gender was introduced exactly because it was considered that people who are born as men and women but identified as the opposite gender or sex, that they need treatment. This treatment, of course, involves both taking hormones and going to a psychiatrist. And nowadays, for example, if you identify as a trans individual and maybe you want to work on yourself so that your body fits social expectation of who is a man or a woman, you need to go to a psychiatrist to confirm that what you think you are, what you say you are, is actually true. So this is still being medicalized and put in this context of psychiatry. And gender was used as a term to differentiate then between those individuals whose born identity matches their bodily identity, from those individuals whose born identity does not match as what they feel like or what they identify with, and therefore the word gender emerged. And to summarize it, so we have a broad difference between sex and gender. When we talk about sex, we put it in a context of biological, natural, embodied differences. We talk about chromosomes, for example, XX for female, XY for males. And of course, we also have different intersex variations, as you can see here. And the estimated prevalence ranges between, as you can see, less than 1% to 2% of live births. However, there is also something called hormonal sex, and as you all know, especially because you come probably from the background of physical anthropology and bioarchaeology, there are, of course, secondary sexual characteristics, and bioarchaeologists mostly deal with those. But we will see also later which other methods can be involved. Now, gender is then something related to sex, but also something different. As I said, these are social cultural interpretations of sexual differences. So, for example, someone is born a man or a woman, but there are certain expectations about how a man or a woman should dress, what a man or a woman should do. And these expectations, these norms, is that what we call gender. Gender can also be, of course, an identity. So I can say that I am a man or that I am a woman. But then you can also judge about my statement, and you can say, well, you know, you say that you're a woman, but you do not look like a woman. And there we come back to this idea of social cultural norms. So how do I have to look in order to be recognized as a woman or a man? And of course, gender can be a relation, and there are relations of all sorts. Some of them are relations of inequality and inequality. For example, when we say that women are subordinated to men, gender is a relational category. And as you can see from this, in most of the cases when different authors speak about gender, they somehow imply that there is this firm base of biological sex and then gender emerges from that. So, for example, being born a man or a woman means becoming a man or a woman in a social cultural sense. And here I would like to stress that this idea is not something new. We already have it in one of the earliest stages of feminist philosophy and literature. And this is an homage to the foundational work of Simone de Beauvoir, Le Deuxième Sexe, from 1949, or The Second Sex in English, where Simone de Beauvoir wrote one of the most quoted lines in gender studies: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And with that, I do not mean, and also she does not mean, that one is born male and all of a sudden, after a while, becomes a woman with female genitals. Of course, the issue of sex change and so on comes in play here. But what Beauvoir wanted to say is that you are born female, but becoming a woman means accepting certain social norms of what you can do, what you have to do, and so on. And then she says that these myths about femininity serve in patriarchal societies to justify the subordination of women. So, for example, when we say women are the weaker sex, they are passive, they are in need of care, and so on, we kind of take away the agency from women to make decisions on their own. To actively participate in social discourse. And as we all know, we already had the International Women's Day. These rights to educate yourself, to have fair or equal payment as your male colleagues are not given. Women in our society have to fight for them. So, as you can see, if we have in most of the cases two biological sexes, one would expect that in every society we would have two social cultural genders, because if we say yes, different societies can interpret biological differences in different ways. Men can dress like this or dress like that, but they are still gendered as men. Then we can close this chapter and say that there's nothing to talk about, because everything which we research are only cross-cultural variations of this sexual essence. However, anthropology has explored the plurality of gender expressions, and there are several cultures in which bodily differences are understood differently than in modern society. And here I would like to quickly summarize how this was tackled by different archaeological communities. And my two examples come from American and European archaeology. So as we all know, American archaeology is embedded in anthropology. So when you study archaeology in the States, you're actually part of an anthropology department, meaning that you also have an ethnographic background. And you learn a lot about anthropology and how you can use ethnographic analogies to interpret prehistoric societies. In European archaeology, things are a bit different because European archaeology is tied to history and historiography. Of course, that doesn't mean that there is no prehistory. There is prehistory. However, prehistory in European archaeology has been always approached in that very sense, like prehistory, something before the written records emerged. So there is not so much comparative societies which are local. Therefore, European prehistorians very often rely on ethnographic analogies from other world cultures to interpret their data. And this is why it is important to understand these ethnographic analogies and what are their limitations. And I would like to start with this now. So is there more than one gender, and how can this be recognized? I'm going to show several examples. The first example comes from Chumash people in southern coastal regions of California, which were already settled in 7th to 5th millennium BC. However, this population existed until 1950 and 14th century of the Common Era, and exploded in that period. So you can see here on the left where the region is located in California, and on the right you can see the distribution of Chumash sites. And for us, it is important to stress that you would expect that Chumash society has a binary concept of gender, that they differentiate between men and women, also based on their biological sex. However, the Chumash, like other Native American populations and cultures, mark their gender, putting emphasis on a supernatural endowment, preferences for types of work or occupation, temperament, and some other attributes which are generally not recognized in the so-called European-derived system, meaning patriarchal cultures of the 19th century. So, for example, among the Chumash, there is a group of people called the Aki, or two-spirit people, and these are biological men who take on certain aspects of clothing and work of women. And interesting for us is that the Aki, or two-spirit people, are often employed as funerary undertakers, so they deal with burials. And Sandra Hollimon has actively dealt with the issue of recognizing Aki in the bioarchaeological record or archaeological record. And she actually managed to show that there are occasional cases of men buried with digging sticks and baskets used for undertaking occupation of organizing burials, digging graves out, and so on. And she showed that these men have the skeletal markers of occupational stress as women, also buried with digging sticks and baskets. And bearing in mind that in this society, only women can work in undertaking businesses, there is an ongoing ethnographic and archaeological explanation that in order for men to participate in such activities, they need to have this identity of the Aki, the so-called third gender. However, here I would also like to stress that we use the term third gender simply because it does not fit our binary view of the world. And from the point of view of the Chumash, Aki is closer to women than to men. So Aki are considered to be more feminine than masculine. They are not really something third. There is another interesting case from South Asia. These are the Hijra, also very often referred in anthropology as the third gender. However, in the category they label as Hijra, we find people who we would understand as either transgender, intersex, or eunuchs, but also post-menopausal women, and elderly ladies, all being Hijra. And these communities are found in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And like the Aki from the Chumash communities, the Hijra are often associated with spiritual and cultural roles, including blessings at births and weddings. And their rights are recognized in South Asia as a third gender. However, again, I would like to stress that we use the term third gender, although from the point of view of these communities, Hijra are closer to women than to men from the point of view of their gender expressions, like being more feminine than masculine. And one more example comes from the region of the world Natasha and I come from, the Balkans. Here in several countries, you're going to find the same phenomenon but named differently. Virgina in Serbian or Burnesha or Vajre Butar in Albanian. And these are people who are assigned female at birth, but take a vow of chastity and live the rest of their lives socially recognized as men. And this right for these women to be recognized as men was in the 19th century even protected by the Ottoman law. So this was a recognized category, and it was punishable by law to call Virgina or Burnesha a woman, because they had to be consistently referred to as men. These people, the Virgina, the Burnesha, had occupations which were the occupations of men. They were in the society of men. They had conversations with men. They made decisions which were made by men. And this maybe comes as strange, being that we are dealing with very patriarchal communities. However, one has to bear in mind that this comes from very patriarchal idea of controlling inheritance. So when a family does not have a male descendant, the property has to stay within the family. Therefore, a living female member of the family takes on the role of a man in order to keep the property within the family household or a clan. And for those of you who would like to give to get like a very, very fast overview about Virgina without having to read a lot of literature, I can recommend this Yugoslav movie directed by Srđan Karanović, which shows all of the issues people who identify as Virgina had in these societies and the struggles they had with their gender. Now, all of these examples I have shown might come forth as exceptions to the general, natural, cultural rule. However, I have to stress that we know that cross-culturally, there were many more such societies, yet through the spread of colonialism, what also spread was patriarchy and heterosexual conception of binary sex, male, female, man, woman. And one of the authors who intensively dealt with this topic was Maria Lugones, who argued that colonialism imposed these Eurocentric values on these societies, and that pre-colonial gender systems in many cultures were more fluid, often recognizing multiple genders, as we have seen. However, as most of these communities also do not write, but they are written about by colonial ethnographers, we have to be careful with these analogies because a lot of them are like transferred fantasies of the colonialists. However, there are some archaeological and historical studies where we can see how this works in specific societies. One of the books I recommend is the one by Leila Popolyazdi and Mariam Desamkhoy on homogenization, gender, and everyday life in pre- and trans-modern Iran. And as you can see here, I summarize some of the basic information. So before the Pahlavi dynasty of the 20th century, since the late 18th until the early 20th century, the Qajar dynasty in Iran or Persia had completely different notions of gender. And what changed is that with the Pahlavi dynasty, gender system was introduced according to a European model. What does that mean? For example, before the introduction of the European model, the Qajar society recognized the category of amrads, which were the so-called beardless young men with a mustache line, and they could have intercourse with adult men, and this was considered to be normal behavior. However, in the moment these young men would grow up and continue to sleep with other men, that would be judged, because they were not judging same-sex relations between men per se, they were judging same-sex relations between men who are of, so to say, the same social status. So as you can see, here we have a completely different idea of gender expression and masculinity. And Amrads was a category not so much related to femininity, but to a very temporary and changeable sexual identity all men can go through. And something similar is also tested in ancient Greece. And now I would like to continue with another case study closer to my field of research, and this is Egyptology. So very quick introduction, chronological and geographical. We are located here in northeastern Africa. During the late Bronze Age, Egypt controlled vast territory from the Levant in the north to Nubia in the south, and was one of the first world empires. And from 2018 to 2019, I dealt with coloniality of gender in New Kingdom Nubia, where I asked the question, what happens with gender when Egypt conquers Nubia? So does a local gender system in Nubia change or not? And if this could be related to Egyptian colonial presence. And the way I wanted to explore this is I examined the cosmetic treatments of the body in Nubia before and after Egyptian colonization of this region. And I focused on all sorts of cosmetic utensils, such as the ones for applying makeup. These are these cold pots and cold tubes I'm now showing, or different tools for repairing or preparing your wig, or razors, combs, cosmetic spoons, and so on. And what actually turned out is that before New Kingdom Egyptian conquering of Nubia and colonization, these objects, which we term cosmetic, were more often found in female burials. So as you can see here, without having this information from bioarchaeology, I could not postulate my model at all. And then it turned out that when the Egyptians conquered, something changed. All of a sudden, men also started using cosmetic utensils and substances more than in the previous period. So what is this telling us? Did all of a sudden Nubian men become more feminine? No. The notion of what is gendered femininity and masculinity changed. Therefore, the use of cosmetics was in New Kingdom Nubia not a gendered category anymore. It was not a difference between men and women. And this is something I managed to show based on more than 1,000 burials and several thousand of these objects found in these burials. And here you can see the result of a contingency test showing that there are no huge differences between men and women, at least when burials are concerned. And now we come to one of the most critical notions of gender theory, and this is gender performativity. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, this is very often misinterpreted. So this idea of gender performativity comes from the work of feminist and queer philosopher Judith Butler, which I also already mentioned at the beginning. What is Butler saying? That feminist scholars were constantly fighting for the rights of women and writing about the category of a woman. However, what Butler says is there is no such thing as a woman. Why? She's not denying the existence of women as human beings. She's saying, well, there are women, but there are also poor women, rich women, women in power, women without power, Black women, white women, Asian women, lesbian women, heterosexual women, bisexual women, heterosexual women who are Black and poor, heterosexual women who are Black and rich. So there is no single experience of womanhood or manhood, even in our society, as we all know. And she says that gender is a performative act. It is not something we are, but something we do. And this is not a radically new idea, as we have seen at the beginning. What is new here is that Judy Butler argues that what you do defines also your sex. So it's not only what you wear, but also how you walk. Do you have a swish in the hip, or are you walking more in a more masculine manner? And one would think, why is this important? Well, it is important because if in certain societies men walk more as female sex, they can get beaten up or even killed. So the societies regulate even the notion of bodily movement, and not only what we wear or what kind of work we do. And therefore, she says that sex is also a constructed category. But I have to stress here, Judith Butler does not say, write, or think that biological sex emerges from thin air. So this is not something which kind of magically appears in a social cultural context. Of course, she is not denying biological differences. What she says is that there are also individuals who are born as intersex individuals. So they can have genital formations which are on a spectrum. They are a variety. They can be born with a very small penis to the extent that it is not even recognized as a penis and so on. And Judith Butler says that the way this works, this construction of sex, is that in order for these people to be normalized, because I think I'm having connection issues. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you. Sorry for this. I had some connection issues. So what she says is that in order for these people to be normalized, medical doctors intervene on them and turn them into proper men or women. So in this sense, for her, that category of sex we consider as normal is a constructed category, even though, as I said at the beginning, the people born as intersex on variation count to up to 2%, they are nevertheless part of our society. And our society wants to eliminate this difference. This is why she says that that category of sex is constructed, not the biological idea of sex as such. And now we come to how does archaeology work with that, of course. So as you know, we differentiate broadly between physical anthropology or bioarchaeology and archaeology in broadest sense, material culture studies dealing with distribution of artifacts in burials, representations of the human body. And whereas physical anthropology is providing the sexing of the bodies, what is often erroneously considered is that archaeology in general, like material culture studies, then produce this category of gender. And how does this work? As you know, anthropologists would sex the physical remains of buried individuals, and then archaeologists would check whether or not there is a correlation between the grave goods and the sex of the individual buried with these grave goods. So, for example, men are buried with swords and women are buried with makeup kits or whatever. And there are numerous examples showing that this is not always the case, that women can also be buried with swords, but we should be careful here. That doesn't mean that these women took any activities in battles, that they fought and so on, but it also does not mean that men who were buried with swords participated in battles or were violent. So having this idea, this notion, this category of sex is not the only information we need in order to make someone into a warrior, man or a woman. And with this, I want to stress that neither physical anthropology alone nor archaeology alone can give answers to all questions we have. We have also the necessity to work both ways. And I guess that most of the people in the audience tonight know more about this than I do. So, of course, it is possible to identify biological sex based on human skeletal remains. But as you also all know, some of the measurements you take fall within a spectrum where some measurements cannot be easily identified as male or female. Therefore, anthropologists very often refer to them as probably male or probably female or unidentifiable. And that does not mean that anyone here wants to completely relativize morphological method of sex assignment. It only means that we should not make assumptions about the sex or gender of those unidentifiable individuals based on the material culture they are associated with in the grave. However, in recent years, there are some new methods which are gaining more and more popularity and presence in archaeology too. And these are modern methods which are biomolecular. They focus on ancient DNA or peptides. So ancient DNA analysis are measuring the presence of the Y chromosome in an individual from DNA in bones or teeth, while peptides examine the presence of dimorphic amylogenins such as amyloid X and amyloid Y. So these peptide analyses are done through mass spectrometry, and in comparison to ancient DNA, they are much more affordable. And what is great about these methods is that now finally we can solve a very big problem in archaeology, and that is the attribution of biological sex to children and also elderly individuals. And I would like to give an example, one of many, where this has been used to check whether or not boys and girls, so young individuals, have been buried in the same way as the adults. Why is this done? Well, in order to see whether children have been assigned with some gendered roles from early on. And indeed, Professor Katrin Rebay-Salisbury from the University of Vienna is one of the authors who, with her team, applied the method of peptide identification of sex to burials to remains of children from early Bronze Age burials, and she and her team demonstrated that male and female subadults were buried as men or women mirroring adult burials. So these expectations, so to say, of how someone is supposed to be buried were present in this early Bronze Age community from very early on. So from early age, boys and girls were expected to fit into certain gender norms, which are attested later. Archaeologists dealing with iconography do not work with human bodies. They rely on representations of the bodies, and these representations of the bodies are, of course, very hard to interpret. One of the examples I would like to show is this Duplaya cart. It's a model made of clay, and it was recovered in the early 20th century by a local farmer in the village of Duplaya in South Banat in Serbia, and it belongs to the so-called Dubovac Žuto Brdo Grla Mare culture of the 16th to 15th century BCE, based on the calibrated radiocarbon dates. And what is interesting about this statue on this model of a cart is that if you look at the iconography, you're going to see a zoomorphic head in the shape of a bird on a human body. And underneath the skirt being worn by this individual, you're going to find a modeled phallus. And then the dress of this individual is a bell-shaped skirt combining ornaments which have parallels in Middle and Late Bronze Age hoards and burials, and these ornaments were used by both men and women. So when you think about the stuff this individual or deity or entity is wearing, the combination is of both artifacts used by men and women in Middle and Bronze Age. However, when you look at the cart itself, you're going to see 3 wheels and also altogether 3 birds. The frontal wheel is held by 2 large ducks with collars on their necks, and 1 small duck is closer to the figurine, and it does not have a collar. And why is this important? Also from the point of view of biology of sexual difference, well, let's have a look at how ducks, male and female ducks, differentiate. So as you can see here, male ducks have the collar and female ducks do not. And also, like in the case of our figurine here, when ducks are not mating, the penis of a male duck is hidden inside the body, and then it emerges during mating with a female in a very complicated sexual act. So this means that when we think about sex and gender, we also have to consider other categories which we nowadays in our society very often do not consider. And also, we have to bear in mind that when prehistory is concerned, we do not have texts which could help us to identify this figure at all. So we do not know if this is a deity, if this is a local magnate, person of a high status, or whoever. We can only speculate about this. One thing is clear, is that although burials are saying one thing, iconography is saying something else, that the gender ideas were not as rigid, but maybe this difference in gender expression was reserved only for certain individuals or entities, and not for everyone. And one of the last examples for tonight I would like to give is how can archaeologists focusing on representations of the human body work together with bioarchaeologists to produce what I consider to be a more informed research. So for example, I have dealt with the representations of Nubian prisoners of war in New Kingdom Egypt. So I already said Egypt conquered Nubia in the late Bronze Age, and in this process, a lot of people from Nubia were taken as prisoners to Egypt. And here you can see how some local Nubians who work for the Egyptian colonial government bring some other Nubians as prisoners of war and enslaved people to Egypt. And among them here is a group of women with children. And if you zoom a bit into this image, you're going to see a red band going here over the forehead of this woman and being connected to a basket on her back in which we find one child. And this is not the only representation. We have many more. Here is one which you can see this red band a little bit better. And you can see that these women can have even more kids in the baskets. So here too, but there are also examples of three. So if you think about the possible average wage of a child, which is in the age of, let's say, up to 5 or 6, then you can imagine that this was quite a burden for these women. And this is also tested ethnographically, that women in East Africa, but also in other cultures all over the world, use these so-called thumb lines in order to carry their weight on the back in these baskets easier. And what we did, we wanted to see if this practice of using thumb lines is something one can recognize in bioarchaeological records. So this was our first research question. And therefore, we examined a Bronze Age cemetery from Sudan, Abu Fatima, which is located, as you can see here, north of Kerma, which was the capital of the Kerma kingdom, conquered by the Nubians a century later. And we examined individuals from skeletal remains of individuals from this cemetery. And as I said, I'm not a bioarchaeologist, so I can only say this in my own words. We wanted to see if the continuous use of thumb lines and carrying of weight leaves traces on the skeletal remains of women or men also. And our results showed that those skeletal markers of occupational stress one would expect from using the thumb line are found on the forehead, but also here on the back on the vertebra. And interestingly, we have a statistical significantly a result showing that this is something we find only in women, and of course only in mature adult or elderly women. So this is not something which is visible on the skeletons of children or young girls, simply because they haven't been using this method for long enough. And therefore, this is one example of how this gender difference in the use of the body can be analyzed using both iconography and bioarchaeology to complement each other. And my last example for today is based on a method which is kind of a key for investigating labor division in settlement archaeology, because as you have seen, all of the examples I have given until now are based on skeletal remains from burials. But how can one do gender archaeology if one does not have burials and works on a settlement archaeology site? Well, in the last decade or so, coming from forensics, there has been a huge development in what I call fingerprinting gender. So you can use rich density of your fingerprint, not to say if the fingerprint comes from a 5-year-old girl or 80-year-old man, but what you can do, you can differentiate certain categories such as children of both sexes and genders, adolescents or elderly individuals, and with mature individuals, you can differentiate between men and women. And you can think about this new method like this. Before this method, we had no idea who, for example, produced pottery. And we were always kind of projecting the idea that because pots are used for cooking, women in all societies cook and produce pottery. And it turns out that this is not the case in several societies. Both men, women, and children were involved in pottery production. And for example, here at Tel Safi early Bronze Age Ghat in now modern Israel, 2/3 of the fingerprints were likely made by adult men and teenage boys, and the remainder by adult women and adolescent girls. Which leads me now to my conclusion. So as you can see from this very broad overview, the concept of sex and gender are heuristic. One does not excavate sex or gender. One uses them to better understand how people in past societies understood their bodies and differences. Because we archaeologists working in historical societies, we also have texts which informs us about how the sexual difference was understood. So for example, in ancient Egypt, Egyptians believed that there is direct connection between the stomach and the vagina and the mouth, so that there are different ways of establishing whether or not a woman is pregnant, something which is completely unimaginable in our society. Yet Egyptians practiced this. So these ethnographic analogies I mentioned before are useful to broaden our perspective of different cultural understandings of sex and gender. However, we always have to remember that these ethnographic cases and analogies are also historically contingent, and they often are representative of these post-contact colonial lifestyles. So they are not always really the original forms of gender expression, and sometimes these original forms of gender expression are completely eradicated by the colonial intervention. Therefore, bioarchaeology is essential for gender archaeology. However, without a social-cultural context, bioarchaeology does not contribute to studies of gender in the past. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Uroš. It was great. I really enjoyed. I would really like to thank you, Uroš, for this wonderful talk, and to all of you that you've been here. And if you're watching us later, please, I will on YouTube, I will put this questionnaire that I really kindly ask you to fill, and also contact of Uroš. So if you have any questions later on, feel free to ask. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.